In 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant approved the peace policy, giving the United States government control over Native American education, thus the creation of the Native American boarding school, in which Richard Pratt described it as the place where an Indian was killed, saving the man. For years, the Native American Indian boarding school system has been below the national standard of schools. Many people along the way have tried to fix it with many different tactics. Some say the government needs to live up to some of the promises that natives were promised over 144 years ago. However, the reason to attend boarding schools has turned from a forceful way to more of an educational way. Beginning post-Civil War, the first phase of the government-run school system for Native Americans was founded. The day school, as it was called. It was a private institution where natives went every day to a school, sometimes traveling up to 3 miles each day just to get a better education. But really, it was the first phase in turning the red man white. The next phase was probably the biggest change in the Native American education system. The day school had transformed into a week school, adding dormitories and housing areas for students. This is because the schools were relocated off reservation and it was impossible for most students to make the daily trek like they once had. However, their parents started to move their teepees to be closer to these schools, so the purpose of these schools was virtually none. Then in 1879, Richard Pratt sought out a different approach when the first Native American Indian boarding school was established in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This was an experimental project in which 60 young boys and 24 girls were taken from their reservations in the Dakotas over 1,500 miles away. The average day for these students consisted of 5:45 a.m. drills, followed by breakfast an hour later. Formal school then started at 9, followed by lunch, then industrial work. Industrial work consisted of blacksmithing and shop work for the boys, while the girls did cooking and sewing work. The day was officially ended at 9 p.m. In the eyes of the government, this was a huge success in taking the Indian out of the man. Their long hair was cut, their buckskin clothes were stripped, and if they were caught speaking their language, they were punished. This caused a lot of boys to run away, but most were unsuccessful. By 1900, there are 460 boarding and day schools, like the one that started in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They stretched from coast to coast. Over 100,000 Native Americans were being forced to attend one of these schools and to abandon their own culture. Despite their severe punishments and torture, Native Americans still held on to their beliefs. They returned back to reservations to become teachers and politicians, trying to better their own tribes. One of these people, Esther Horn, an alumni from Haskell Institute Boarding School, became a teacher. She went on to teach such students as Dennis Banks, George Mitchell, and Leonard Peltier, who became leaders of the 1960s and 70s American Indian movement. Their cause was well known, but some of their actions were viewed as harmful and tactics almost militant. One person who favored their involvement and turned for the American Indian movement was Gerald Gray Sr., an enrolled member in the Blackfoot and Little Shell tribes. In an off-camera interview, he explained to me that he favored the effort and intentions of the 1960s and 70s American Indian movement, but disagreed with their militant-like tactics. However, the role of the educational system ran the same, with the only reason for attending the boarding schools turning for the better, even though the American Indian movement had created a change. The main reason now for attending boarding schools was it became a place for troubled students to attend rather than any student being forced to come. One student who was sent there due to being a troubled student was Cody Ox Wheeler, who attended Chamawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon. He explained to me his interaction with the boarding school system in an interview. So, Mr. Wheeler, can you explain to me your reason for going to Chamawa Indian School? Was it good? Bad? Do you think you benefited from it?
Well, the experiences were good and bad because I got sent there out of trouble, and there was people that attended willingly, and there's people that got sent there unwillingly. But my experience was good because I met a lot of Native Americans from other tribes I didn't really see outside of the box.
So personally, do you feel the purpose of the boarding school system has changed since the beginning to when you were a student?
You know, when I attended Chamawa Indian School, it's a lot different because it's pretty much reversed. They teach you to be proud of your culture, be proud to be a part of powwows, teach you how to make dream catchers, paint, make pottery, and so on. So it's pretty much a 180 from the early 1900s to the turn of the century, because now it's more taught to make you be proud of who you are.
In comparison to other American schools, where would you rate the Native American boarding schools?
It's pretty much the Indian education isn't that great compared to private schools.
Personally, again, how do you feel boarding schools should change so that they do reach a better quality level of education? Because it's proven that they are below the national standard in comparison to other schools.
So yeah, I think that it would be better if they were to change them to Indian private schools pretty much, and pretty much bring in better, higher end staff and more one-on-one treatment.
From your experience, would you say a white teacher or Native American teacher has a better impact on a Native American student like yourself?
Don't really have too many examples, but yes, I believe that Native Americans do have better connection with other Native Americans. It's it goes back to when you really want to compare nuts and bolts. Your kind will look after your kind, meaning I realized people getting better treatment, me being Native American and me now being Caucasian, in Ruidoso schools and public schools compared to being at a Chamawa Indian school. And yes, I do believe that when it's your own race, you do get a better connection.
Not only did students like Mr. Wheeler feel the change of the boarding school system, but so did administrators. So during the 1960s and 70s, few Native Americans like Gerald Gray Sr. decided to get involved in Native American education. This created a small turn for changing and bettering Native American education. So Mr. Gray, would you agree with Mr. Wheeler that in fact Native American teachers have a better connection with Native American students?
There is a slight edge that our Native teachers often connect more and can do a better job with our children.
So is that the reason you wanted to become a teacher, or is there something else that made you want to become a teacher?
I attribute that to our families staying together, whereas a lot of the other children, their parents got into drugs and alcohol. I blame drugs and alcohol addiction a lot onto poverty.
It is stated in the National Status of Residential Life 2005 survey report that most students with a drug and alcohol background are being sent to boarding schools. What do you think is a plan to reform the system and get these kids off life-threatening substances?
They need to implement the therapeutic aspect of it. I don't know how many schools are doing that because I have left the system in 1996, and I'm not sure how many boarding schools are implementing these most needed programs.
With all this evidence and proof that the turning point of the boarding school system was in fact that it changed from taking the Indian out of the man into a place to send troubled natives, what changes could you suggest in order to create a better school system?
One of the senators will take and do the study on the injustices and the failures to meet in the promises that government made to Indians, and reintroduce a bill that would help to fund these programs to the extent that other programs are funded throughout the United States.
Although no one has attempted to reintroduce this bill, the educational system still stands as broken, and it remains a place to get rid of troubled students. Even though the system has turned away from its old harsh racial ways, it still needs change. It is proven that this was the greatest turning point in Native American education, because the reason for attending these schools is now by choice, and you get to learn more culture rather than turning away from it. That still doesn't mean that this is the last turning point. I feel that this is a mere baby step in order to reforming Native American education. Thank you.